Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second day of Chair Poetry Evenings. This is Calcutta's very own International Poetry Festival. This evening, we have with us four brilliant poets from different countries: Nikola Madzirov, Elisa Biagini, George Szirtes, and Ermine. We begin the session with Nikola, and I would like to invite him to read his poems. But before that, I would read his bio. It's a long bio, and I had to edit it, and there it is. Nikola Madziro is a Macedonian poet, editor, and translator. His poetry examines both personal and cultural geography. He is the author of several collections of poetry. His work has been translated into more than 30 languages. That speaks for itself. Over to you, Nikola.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to be in India in a way, but also in Italy and UK. I think this is the way how our voice will travel today, and maybe that's why I would like to start with a poem that talks about uncertainty, about dislocation, about borders that we all want to cross and to feel our shadow from the other side. I will read it first in English, and if you allow me, I will read one poem in Macedonian as well.
Sure.
Home. I lived at the edge of the town, like a street lamp whose light bulb no one ever replaces. Cobwebs held the walls together and sweat our clasped hands. I hid my teddy bear in halls in crudely built stone walls, saving him from dreams. Day and night, I made the threshold come alive, returning like a bee that always returns to the previous flower. It was a time of peace when I left home. The bitten apple was not bruised. On the letter, a stamp with an old abandoned home. From birth, I have migrated to quiet places, and voids have clung beneath me, like snow that doesn't know if it belongs to the earth or to the air.
Beautiful.
Thank you, and I will read this in Macedonian and the next poems in English. Dom. Žive na крајот од градот како улично светло на кое никој не му ја менува светилката. Пајажината ги држеше зидовите заедно, а потта нашите споени дланки. Во преобразбите на невешто со зиданите камења го крие плишаното мече, спасувајќи го од сонот. Денонокино го оживував прагот, враќајќи се како пчела што секогаш се враќа на претходниот цвет. Беше мир, која го напуштив домот. Гризнатото јаболко не беше потемнето, на писмото стоеше марка со стара напуштена куќа. Кон тивките простори од раѓање се движам и под мене празнини се лепат, како снег што не знае дали на земјата или на воздухот припаѓа. Next poem. What we have said haunts us. We have given names to the wild plants behind unfinished buildings, given names to all the monuments of our invaders. We have christened our children with affectionate nicknames taken from letters read only once. Afterwards, in secret, we have interpreted signatures at the foot of prescriptions of incurable diseases. With binoculars, we have zoomed in on hands waving farewell at windows. We have left worlds under stones with buried shadows on the hill that guards the echo of the ancestors whose names are not in the family tree. What we have said without witnesses will long haunt us. The winters have piled up in us without ever being mentioned. Usual summer nightfall. This is what summer nightfall is like. The adulteress comes onto the balcony in a silk nightgown that lets through the trembling of the stars. A twig drops from the beak of a bird that falls asleep before it has built its home. A soldier lowers the flag of the state with a letter from his mother in his pocket. An atomic tests in the womb of the earth secretly revive the dead. At the moment, someone quietly interprets Byzantine numis. Someone else falsifies the exoduses of the Balkan and the civil wars in the name of universal truth. In the factory yards, the statues of participants in annual revolutions sleep. On the symmetrical graves, plastic flowers lose their color and ordinary ones their shape. But this piece of the dead we have parted from is not ours. In the village with 3 lit windows, a fortune teller foresees only recoveries, not illnesses. The waves throw up bottles enough to hold the whole sea. The arrow on the one-way road sign points to God. A fisherman rips off a bit of the sky as he casts his baited line into the river. Some poor child searches for the little bear and the planet he'd like to come from. In front of the doorstep of the killer with an alibi, a feather attempts to fly. This is what usual summer nightfall is like. The town combusts in the redness of the moon, and the fire brigade ladders seem to lead to heaven, even then when everyone is climbing down them.
It's lovely.
And the last poem I like to read is a poem dedicated to Vasco Popa.
Mm-hmm.
Before I read it, I want to also thank to my translators, Peggy and Graham Reed, that did the translation of the poems I read.
Yes, please.
To the publisher, and the poem I will read now is translated by Sasha Dagdel together with her, and the title of the poem is The Eye, to Vasco Popa. Open one eye only. The horizon is in the closed eye. Open the seashell. No solitude will escape. The stones on the riverbed drink up time. The dead fish swim towards the sun. Open one eye only. The world is a young tree on a building site. Windows are rivers of our uncertainty. Open the sky. In my hands, I keep a home, a prayer room in a hospital garden. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Poems of hope, poems to look forward to, especially in these times of darkness and despair. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And our next poet is Elisa Biagini. Elisa is a poet from Florence, Italy. She has published 7 poetry collections. Her poems have been translated into many languages, and she has published editions of her poetry in Spain and the USA. She has published an anthology of contemporary American poetry, Nuovi Poeti Americani. She lives in Florence and teaches writing at NYU Florence. Over to you, Elisa.
Thank you. I also want to thank you, everybody, and it's a great idea to, all things considered, to still have a festival. We also have a very small festival here in Florence, and we had it last 2 months ago in September. We were meeting whether to do it or not, but we thought that it's a strong, sign of how important poetry is in this moment always, but even more now. So it's important to keep this connection like flowing in any way possible. I would love to come to India as soon as possible, but for the time, I think this will be good. Okay, so I will read a few poems and I'll do the same. I'll probably read the English first, and just some of them I'll read the Italian as well. This is from this collection called The Guest in the Wood. And it's a pretty old poem, but it's quite representative also what I'm writing now. You show me your wounds like a soldier, your battle against another you, consuming your eyes, bones, skin, who cut your tendons a while ago, the cord that holds you, diver who won't resurface. Mi mostri le ferite da soldato, la tua battaglia contro un'altra te che ti consuma negli occhi, nelle ossa, nella pelle, che ha tagliato i tuoi tendini da tempo, il filo tutto intero che ti tiene, palombaro che più non risale. I translate your life through feng shui prescriptions. I glue your vocal cords back together. I tune the voice you had, the language that was written in your body, that was washed away with bleach, with wind, with dishwater. I read it to you, again, in those radiographies that you carry around like your portfolio to the gallerists, and in the dust at the bottom of the drawers, and left in gloves, in all these years of acid rain that has cleaned your bones like silverware.
Awesome.
Between us, voice doesn't travel like a hairdryer underwater, but it stops like a switch turned on or off at random. We too are a country under embargo, living on parentheses and silence, on blackouts, so that when the light returns, we have already forgotten what to say. Tra noi la voce non conduce e arriva come fon dentro l'acqua, ma si ferma come d'interruttore, acceso o spento, a casaccio. Noi due siamo un paese sotto embargo, che vive di parentesi e silenzi, di blackout, sì che quando la luce poi ritorna, noi ci si è già dimenticati cosa dire. Couple of more poems from another collection. This one's called The Plant of Dreaming. I like to show the covers because it's a beautiful artwork of my partner, who's a Serbian visual artist. So it's just making some, advertisement for other arts as well. English first and then Italian. When the eye grows dim, don't look for the warmth of the hand that lowers the eyelid. Escape from the melody of the word, the voice that smiles at you through false feet. If language is world, is mirror, be in it with your pupil wide open. Fish out from that black, the ink that speaks words vertically. In its shadow, questions grow. Space is given to thoughts breathing. not horizontal words that submerge, but the wide of margins, the pose that covers the absence between you and me. Actually, I'll read another poem. I'm not going to read the Italian on the one I just read to you because I don't feel like doing it now. I don't think it's right. Against the Wind. This is the, what I read is the first poem of the collection. This is the last one. I twist the paper in my hands, reignite the breath in my throat, look at the letters with all those blades like the shadows of things never said. I make night and then hold the paper close. Your darkest word brings me light, pulses in my palm, all of its silence. A seed this, that it's never consumed. Against the wind, words are only callings out, saliva that comes back in your mouth. Controvento. Mi rigiro la carta tra le mani, mi riannodo il respiro nella gola, guardo le lettere con tutte quelle lame come le ombre delle cose poi mai dette. Faccio buio e dopo accosto il foglio, la tua parola più scura mi fa luce, pulsa nel palmo tutto il suo silenzio. È questo un seme che mai si consuma. Controvento le parole sono solo richiami, saliva che ti torna in bocca. I think that's it, right? We're not of time. So thank you. Thanks.
So much, Elisa. I think there's some problem with the audio. Can everybody hear me?
We have a hard time hearing you, Saima.
I cannot hear you at all. You can't hear me.
It's
Can't hear you, Simon.
Can you hear me, George?
Very faintly.
Very faint.
Yeah, very faintly
So
here too. Yeah.
next turn is you. It's you who will be reading, and I would like to introduce you. George Szirtes is the poet and translator. He was born in Budapest in 1948 and came to England after the 1956 Hungarian Uprising. His collection Real won the T.S. Eliot Prize in 2004. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 1982 and has since won many awards for his works. He lives in Norfolk and taught creative writing at the University of East Anglia. He has published several collections of books, and here we present to you George. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll begin with a poem about getting old. The title is Dotage, which is an old word really for that stage of old age when you begin to lose focus. And I'm now 72, so I begin to listen out for the signs of dotage. Occasionally they hear dotage shuffling up and down the hall, hesitating at the door and asking in its feeble, high-pitched voice if it is time yet. Is it time? No, it is not, they answer, straightening their backs. Move away from the door, we need to use it. And so it shuffles off, mumbling to itself, disliking its own caricature gait and ever less firm grip on irony, while they get on with life and slamming doors. I see my father with his dotage grin and watch as his eyes slowly turn to mine. Get out, Dad, I tell him. Go now, while you can. Then realize he got out years ago. I put my slippers on and comb my hair, pleased to see how dark it is, like his. There are doors leading to other doors, they say, forgetting now to close them. In the past year or so, we have lost two friends long before their time. And I think back to my youth when death was a kind of interesting idea, somewhat romantic, and that one would die before one got old. This is not about old age. This is about sudden, fearful loss. Rehearsal for a lament. Life is cruel. Has anyone thought to say so? It strikes me now as original and wise. Has anyone dared to look into its eyes and claim to understand or know what goes on there? Not me. I thought I knew. But it's just one of those stupid things you do when you are young and like dramatic scenes to play themselves out to a proper score. But you can't help it. You know little more than self and the sleek props on which it leans. Imagination needs its props, it's true. And you imagined what you thought you knew. You can't imagine death, not as it is, in the mouths of the living and the very near, who you imagined would just disappear the way you might yourself, all pieties and innocence. You thought you'd thought it through, but it's just one of those stupid things you do. Then this happens, the awful bloody thing that lurked beneath your dreams but didn't show. It wasn't something you could see or know for what it was, or what it might still bring to sober you up. You didn't have a clue. You imagined things that once you thought you knew. You think this clever verse can foul you up with its own pleasure that it knows is vain. Give me a rhyme. Now rhyme it once again. Keep language prancing. Never let it stop. In case you once forget, you have no clue that it's just one of those stupid things you do. Come back, come back. Stop suffering like that. You who were made for loving, not for grief as bad as this. Such pain without relief. We should know death and have it all off pat. But it's not death, it's you we owe love to, imagining things that once we thought we knew. That should be followed by a poem about resurrection, a song of resurrection. We die and come awake just in time to die again. It is the route we are bound to take. It's good as gold and right as rain. We kiss and part and kiss, and then we come to kiss once more. Of parting we know only this. We open, then we close the door. We rise and lie and rise. Upright we are against the grain. We open, then we close our eyes. And look, we die, then arise again. I read you The Lady with the Ermine. She's a famous Leonardo painting. It's a fantasy based on that. Sometimes it is hard to tell one from the other. Lady and Ermine in conversation with some mutual metaphor are both metaphors. Yet she is herself, the lady, that is, beyond the invitation to contemplate her as sister to the Ermine, as is the Ermine that is just Ermine. Art is often confusing. Woman and Ermine appear to combine into a valid image of sinuous life, of vivacity and grace, both valuable, both beautiful. Listen, it is night. Do you hear laughter? Creatures imagine themselves sniggering at you. Wake up, madam, you are free. Bring us the ermine. Hold it in your arms. This is your invitation. Imagine it so. And I'll finish with 3 tiny poems written over a lockdown period. They are parts of a long set of short 10-line poems. And these are 3 poems, I suppose, about compensatory pleasures. The first is just about the pleasure of words, sound of words, of saying words, sensuous pleasures, but pure language. Sylph, nymph, salamander, sulfur. One might make a list, a miscellany of words of delight, of mere movements of the mouth, and be satisfied. It's little enough, my love, this slightest stirring of pleasure. Stay there, speak the words to me. Glory. Sometimes you hear it. What? Nothing. What do you mean? I mean, just nothing. The nothing between that signifies nothing and where we must live, somehow glorious and nothing, full of itself. What is it full of? The glory, nothing. And lastly, the consolations. The terrible years are the terrible years. But be consoled, sweet bird. The beautiful years always intervene. No year is an entire waste. Here are the fragments. Here is the broken window. Come to me, small bird. Sing your bright summer. Thank you.
Marvelous, George. Thank you so much for your beautiful poems. Am I audible enough now?
Yeah, you're good.
Yes, yes. So now we move to our next poet, Harry Mann. Harry Mann is a British poet and visual artist. He was a 2016 Toast poet, and currently he's a 2020-2021 Das House Lab Fellow. He writes and performs for a children's theatre company with Canadian contemporary dance choreographer Jennifer Essex. His work has been featured on BBC Radio and at festivals internationally. Over to you, Harry.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and to be reading for you. I'm just going to read a poem from this book, Finders Keepers, which is all about endangered species in the UK. And this poem is after dunlins, who are these small brown striped birds that congregate together, a bit like football supporters. And in a time like this, it's good to know that there are still congregations happening of some description. Dunlins after dunlins. So many white bellies constellate along the water's jogged mirror. And near and across the no mooring sign, where I found mysteriously part of a car stereo. The knocking ribs, the metronomic masts and surf and back to roost together. Years before, both 15, she pulls my hand, holding still as best I can to her waist, warmness through her borrowed sweater, writing her number in blue biro, digit by firm ovular digit. How I was too shy to ever call. How all of that happened on this reserve. The dunlins roll by again. One of the flock is blown all over in the tightness of her toppling turn. To you or me, a couple of 1,000 feet in the air or more. Clenches her wings again, and once more in a startling arc of the purest kind of dare. Following on from my first book, sorry, to parade books in front of you, which was about spaceflight, Lift. I wrote some more poems about spaceflight in a kind of after echo. And this is one of them, and it's called Things to Consider Before Your First Spacewalk. When you want to burst into bits, that is what they call it. Space exposure. In 14 seconds, you pass out from oxygen loss. You're able to see the Earth. It is so unaffordable, so hard to act without your lungs. Beyond the cold, the spiraling Milky Way will outgrow the size of yourself. The dropping dark lights the way home. One night is as long as a lesson in biology. What goes up must keep going up. A flipped lid can be a deadly weapon. When there's nothing to hold on to, there is nothing to hold on to. And now for something a little bit lighter. I was fortunate enough to spend some time in Wordsworth Cottage and to be a poet in residence up there in Cumbria. And it's really sort of startling, sort of a Disney-like skyline you see every night, these kind of violet skies. And in any case, I took one of Wordsworth's famous poems and subjected it to the Oulipo N+7 technique, which is taking a noun, every noun in the dictionary that you find in the poem, and going into the dictionary and taking the 7th noun along and replacing it each time. So each noun is replaced. And I found that N+7 wasn't enough. So I went further and further and ended up with N+20. So hopefully from the title, you recognize the poem. I water skied lonely as a clownfish. I water skied lonely as a clownfish that flusters on hijackings, o'er vanishing creams and hindsight. When all at once I saxophoned to a crow's nest, a hot air balloon of golden daisy chains beside the Lollapalooza, beneath the tree of life, fly fishing and dandruffing in the bric-a-brac. Continuous as the stars that show and tell and two-step on the Milky Way, there was strewn a newly wed lingua franca along the marinated beachfront. 10,000 I saxophoned at a glassworks, tractor beaming their headings in sprightly dandruff. Wax jackets beside them dandruffed, but they outperformed the spawning wax jackets in glissandos. A point of departure could be nothing but geeky in such a Johnny-come-lately compatibility. I gelatinized and gelatinized, but little transference on what weather stations the shutdown to me had built in. For oft, when on my local councillor I lie, when vacuuming or pensive moonwalking, they flight simulator upon that inward eye shot, which is the blockbuster of soluble antibodies. And then my heat exchanger with plesiosaurs fills and dandruffs with the daisy chains. I'm just going to read 2 more poems. While working on Lift, I discovered that the British Nightingale was going extinct, and it was quite an unbearable discovery. One of a very happy memory I have is from being a kid in South London, and very suddenly we heard, in amongst all the traffic, a nightingale, and it was so rare and so unusual that my mother kind of ran out into the street to listen to it, and I followed, wondering what she was doing. This poem is about the nightingale. I actually don't enjoy their songs as much as perhaps I should in order to carry the moniker of a poet. But anyway, the nightingale. In practice, this nightingale's words swerve, herded into home video, air-stuffled foreground wall sound, the wind that wears at altitude the oral cavities of avian hearing, in the piece from the birch where wash is a verb of weatherfront heard while circling the circuit of hand-me-down hunting grounds, microscoping the Medway-soaked plantain for what itches in the ultraviolet, signals aeronautic, arcs synaptic across the hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain, hover held, a fulgurite voice print following fit phrase, memorized in the buffer B-mind, reckoning the rote intones the thatch calyx of nest and sulk, skull vaulted song in air sacs stacks the socketing of gases that surge electric, sublate, regulated by the lungs, the heart, the stomach, heart and lungs. The carrier wave of pulses gyroscopic through curves of the skin-thick crown, coast magnetic, less dead cert, but surfs a feeling for Norfolk, Shaker's Wood, next crests hemispheres never blackening out, dips to pitch, downs the tent of its wings, folds with the grain of the wind, a skiff skirting the transparent cerebella of high canopies, weighing sail search with why, whichever perch works to see what kill comes, if it comes to kill first, and shudders bursts of nerved stuttering, the head cicading for the sake of the eye, the sinuses hum in syrinx territory calls, chiaroscuro, resonant, stridulating, lift, ululations, Senegambian, the wind changes. You hear it, the nightingale, a female singing in nervous laughter, a musical birthday card addressed to the bed, a holiday maker's car alarm, loud and long and penetrating and worrying, between wanting attention and warning, breaking off into an uneasy peace. Thank you very much for listening. I've really enjoyed this. This is last poem I'm going to read is from a sequence of elegies that I've been working on. And by the number, it probably will give you an indication as to just how large this project is. This is Elegy 58. And they're in memory of a mass shooting that took place in 2011 in Norway. This poem is based on the Dog Vision by Black Elk, who was a member of the Lakota tribe and toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And he was asked about the future and had this vision. Arising out of the holy sweet grass, leaning like blossom tripping over itself, these butterflies drew around me, so new and so numerous that soon I saw nothing else, and I could hear them whimper as if they were weeping, but I was the one who wept to see them tumble like empty tents away from me. Where my footprint was, there was quick moving cloud, a shoal of aspen leaves, and at the puddle's edge, along the muddy shore, among the little wakes were flocking all the people of the earth, the smoke of my blood curling quietly around the higher leaves, sisters, brothers, the born and not yet born, all joining colours. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Harry. And the line is resonating in my ears when you said Nightingale, a beautiful musical greeting card. So lovely. And we have a lot of time, so I'm sure our audience would be interested to know more about the poets and their poetry. So how about a few questions?
Okay.
Nicola, George, Elisa.
Okay.
Yes, so shall I begin with Nicola? Hello, Nicola, you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So wonderful rendition, and our audience must be interested. And let's talk about your poetry. And I was going through your interviews and your poems, and there is a lot of write-up about you on internet. And you said that the translator is a silent deconstructor, a light bridges of difference and understanding. Tell us more about it.
I always think that usually I come from people that say so-called small languages.
Mm-hmm.
And I often quote what Sion said about Icelandic people when they say that it's not, there are no big and small languages. It's a matter of numbers. There are just languages spoken by less people, or it's a matter of this. We don't put quality when we talk about big and small languages. But I have to say that I write in a language spoken by 2 million people. So the only way to, I would say, to grab the world through words or through silence is to translate. And I was always reading first the translations in other languages because Macedonia was part of Yugoslavia. So first the translations will come in Serbian or Croatian, and maybe after years in Macedonian, but then I started reading in English. So translating became kind of a matter of solitude, a matter of intimacy, how to connect to the language of your childhood. And I think that in that sense, for me, translating is, I usually say it's not about losing or gaining something, but it's about reconstructing in the most productive way. I wouldn't say repeating, because repeating is connected usually to routine. But for me, translation is kind of ritual, not a routine. In that way, I imagine always the translator as kind of a bridge in darkness of languages, because you feel the sound of the river, but the bridge is there, and it allows the river to flow.
So the translator is holding the reader's hand and taking him or her ashore, correct?
Yeah, I don't want to mystify things. I don't want to use the words medium or something, but George would say Elisa also translates. They are brilliant translators. So in a way, it's a way of reading that because you go deeper in the layers. You go deeper in the sound. You go deeper in the meaning of things. And you know, when you go deeper, it's colder and darker there. And what you have to do is to bring back the light of the words in the language. I would say again, in your childhood, or the language you use the language of your childhood to deliver it to the language that you speak now, you write on. And this connection is, again, I would say, refreshing your memories, and maybe the one of the most beautiful ways to justify your silence when you don't write your own work.
Also, there's a sense of transit, sense of flight and escape in your poems. So is the poet here an immigrant, or is it the poem which is trying to escape from the poet and from the people and from itself?
Well, I used to say, like, first trips, you say there are journeys, there are from you want to go somewhere else, but in fact, I realized that there were escapes. So I prefer when I escape myself as let's say, entity in my body. I don't want to say that literature is escape, but I rather escape from things than I want to escape while writing, because writing is more facing than escaping. And in that mirror of uncertainty, I find myself that changing places is, in a way, is I was doing just to justify again the changing of voices that I have accumulated from living in different countries, different ideology. I was born in communism, then I had to accept another reality. I was born under another flag, then to have accept another flag. My grandmother used to say, you travel so much, and I changed 5 countries just by sitting in my bed. And it's true. She didn't move from her room, and she changed 5 countries on Balkans. And in that way, I found also the story that about my second name, that means refugee in Arabic. And it's a long story, because my ancestors were war refugees from Balkan Wars 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see that you just continue the story, and I will be happy if this story doesn't repeat as farce as it is in official histories. When you realize that you don't do anything new, that you just continue the story, then you feel more relaxed, and you understand that all different voices are inside you, and you don't need to change places.
Mm-hmm.
Escape is more, I would say, archaeological. I want to see an escape from the archaeological side.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about only changing places, it's also digging in time. And that's how I find, when I different space or different home or dislocate mostly when I write.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Thank you for sharing your views with us.
Thank you.
Now I'll go to Elisa. Elisa, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. So I was going through one of your interviews, and I came across something very interesting. You mentioned that you find the idea of Florence more powerful than the place itself. Is it because of its grand literary tradition, which can weigh really heavy?
Yes, absolutely. Even to talk about this now, it's kind of strange because all of a sudden, since March, we got very little tourists. So, just reminded me that I was born in 1970 and I was like 5, 6 years old. We didn't get, I mean, we still got lots of tourists because we started getting them the time of, whatever, the 1800s massive and 900s on. But so eventually the idea of Florence became quite a burden in a sense, quite, heavy to deal with. And even though the older I get, obviously, the more I see how much of Florence is inside me, how much I was born and raised here. Besides 5 years in the US, I spent all my life here. And, when you have so much beauty, it could kind of get in the way in a sense of seeing things because you're constantly surrounded and everything else, it's hard to evaluate in a sense other things, and you become very not that tolerant toward other situations that are not this beautiful in a sense, even though what is beauty, that's a whole complicated issue. This is something we talk a lot about with my writing students, because they come here in Florence, particularly in the United States, but from all over the world, and they're immediately paralyzed by being in Florence. They don't know what to write about. Everything is so beautiful. It's like, come on, let's, not get frozen. Just move on and try to interpret this place and see the layers and see the complication and see how much it's a living thing, right? It's not like frozen in time, and therefore it has all the problems. When I usually tell my students that Florence smells, usually you don't get that from postcards, but because it's a normal place where people live and things happen. And so it's a complicated relationship. This is a kind of like, member of the family you constantly have to deal with, but you have this love and hate relationship.
Love it, hate it.
Yes, exactly.
But live with it and live in it.
Yes, exactly. No, but the older I get, the more I see how much I'm made of it, obviously, and how important it is for me. I wanted to go back to something that Nicola said about, we're talking about translation and going down. Obviously, I'm from Florence, so guess what? Have you heard of this guy called Dante? And the fact that he has been like going down, in the depths, never, right? In the depths of obviously of life, the meaning of life, philosophy, but also language. So that's what we do when we translate. And the more we love the poets we translate, the more complicated it is. I'm just done translating a short selection of Paul Celan's poems, because this month will be his 100th birthday, and this year he committed suicide 50 years ago. So it's a very important year for Paul Celan's work. And so that was obviously a very tough struggle, because he's a poet I love very much. In my not this last collection, but the previous one, I had a whole section of my book when I was fighting, in a sense, or interacting or create a dialogue with single lines of his poetry. And I wrote my own poems around those lines, those single lines, and I retranslated from German into Italian. And so I just, I love his work so much. And the more I translate, the more I feel bad about my own poetry. But the more I do this translation, the more I learn about the process of writing, the more, therefore, so it's such a complicated, intense, physically intense, right? Because what the thing about translation is that at the end of the day, it's like, whew, like you feel like you've run for miles. And that's why it's also very fascinating when you get translated, because you know how hard it is. So you can absolutely appreciate the work is done, and how you always get this close to the text, and you can never get it, but you still have to try. So this constant like trying and going back, and so it's, and to me, it's so incredibly physical. So I just want to add this.
Lovely.
Yes, that's beautiful. And I also noticed that your poetry is bound by fragments, distorted maps, recipes of human horror, broken stars. Is the poetry creating a mosaic design here?
Yeah, in a sense, I strongly, believe in the idea. A poem I read before talks about the importance of margins. To me, lots of my poems are very, very short, and I can show you an example. This will be the average length of the poem. And to me, that white space is really important, because it's the space where I can meet the reader. It's like an empty room, right? There is a text in the middle, and basically it's where we meet. So it's one step the reader, one step the writer. It's not that I attack, the poor reader with like an avalanche of words. There's like, gonna die. Or it's so we create this space where we both have to move forward, but finding a nice space where we can start a dialogue. So to me, those fragments, in a sense, are the beginning of a bigger conversation. And it's also connected with the idea that I got my, I'm an art historian. My master's is in art history, then I also teach literature because my PhD is in literature. But for me, so those images, this visual world is very important. Therefore, lots of times I have these fragments of images of artworks that then connects it, creates this, electric, moment with language.
PowerPoint slides, sort of, they keep appearing and disappearing, and then starts all over again, right?
Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Elisa. That's wonderful, beautiful to hear from you about how poetry works for you and how Florence appeals to you and not so appeals to you. Still, you are there and Florence is there for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
George, you there?
I'm here.
Yes. George, how do you like to define poetry as a complex truth?
It is so by its nature. I think that was my very first instinct when I began to write at the age of 17. There were things to be said and perceived that could be perceived in language, and that somehow that language would modify the perception and would arrive at somewhere which would feel like understanding. And that this kind of understanding was very rare in normal life, in our conversations, in our normal affairs. And that within poetry, there are, if you like, depths of language, ambiguities of language. And it's when you read a text, a poetic text, it's almost like hearing a chorus, a set of possible parallel texts, and you're listening out for those. And that is what we, I think, respond to. in any case, I think that is the instinct I have been working with, and I do think it's primarily an intuitive art. It's fascinating. I loved Nicola's when he was talking about translation. I think translation is such a fascinating sort of enterprise because you are faced by a great many details in front of you, and you're faced with a search for equivalents to those details. But within those details, you're also listening to the intuitive aspect of the poem, which is not necessarily a purely kind of lexicon-based set of meanings. But I think translation and poetry are quite closely aligned because a translated poem is a poem. It's not just a translation.
So how has your own poetry influenced your translation work, given you have done immense bodies in terms of translation?
Well, I'm writing in my second language chronologically. I didn't speak any English before the age of 8, and I don't write in my first language. And really the reassociation, my first language began in 1984, when I went back to where I was born in Budapest and heard not just the language, but the way the language was spoken and the circumstances in which the language was spoken. And that, if you like, it began to inform my own poetry very strongly. I couldn't really define the ways it has done so, but I know it is so. So my reading of Hungarian poetry has entered to some degree, but I don't know to what degree, my own writing of English poetry, because I cannot quite write like a native English person. I'm close, but in fact, I work out of a synthetic set of intuitions. I listen for what I know. English literature is a literature I first read. I studied art. I was a painter. In a way, the entering of one language into another is, I think, in some respect, the poetic process. It is a point at which the information from the senses, from the memory, for one sense of walking in whole cities full of words, shift from place to place. And that is its potency, I think. That is its memorability, along with all kinds of technical features which are part of poetry. More recently, from what I read, you might have seen, there were a couple of poems which use rhyme quite strongly, which has always fascinated me, just as a rhyme is an accident waiting to happen. And to see what happens once these accidents begin to come together. I think an awful lot of this is blind flying. We are like pilots without proper maps. But you set out to fly and you hope to make a memorable journey.
So with immigration, poetry is also immigrating with the poets, and especially how much of your childhood spent in Budapest forms the cornerstone of your poetry? 8 years, you were 8 when you came to the UK.
I didn't think very much until I went back. And I realized I recognize many things I didn't expect to recognize. I recognize the sound of the street, the smell of buildings, the sense of space, all these things to be inside a map, a childhood map, maybe even a pre-childhood map that one grows up with, which is a way of understanding the world. And I think the emigration, which you undertook, we came as refugees to England, was in a way an easier process for me than it was for my parents, who were thoroughly soaked in the world from which they emerged, whereas I had grown a little way through it and then carried on growing in a second language, which became very familiar, which became a new home. But there are these two homes.
Thank you so much, George. That's quite insightful, and I'm sure our audience would be loving this conversation that we're having here. And now over to Harry. Harry,
Yes.
wonderful listening to your Nightingale poem. You have written a lot about nature addressing environmental issues, and what do you think, how much role of an activist can a poet play? Not directly, but subtly, indirectly.
I think it's, I think very often in conversations about politics and action in poetry, people tend to quote from Auden and say, you know, poetry can make nothing happen, which is sort of slightly taking this idea out of context of that elegy for Yeats. But I think really, in reality, the poem itself is a memorizable tool, has a mnemonic quality, and it's something that stays with you in your mind. And if it's something that you can fix a point, like you can fix a point on a map in somebody's mind with a poem, then you've altered the way they think, and you've altered the way in which they consider the world around them. And of course, with that our political questions. In terms of the way in which a poet can be an activist of some description, it's interesting to see how much in the modern era, following on from, you know, obviously the disastrous Brexit referendum here in the UK, how much the stigma has been removed from the word activist, and in fact more pushed upon those of us who believe, of which I would say it's the majority, believe that there's been a wide disinformation campaign, and how we combat that. And that does require an investment in the democratic process. In other words, turning up to protest peacefully, considering those issues and putting them into your poems, such that they're memorizable, but also thinking a little bit with the eye of a copywriter as to how you can make something, stay in somebody's mind, and to be epigrammatic. Love trumps hate. So there are a lot of those questions. So I think, in terms of an activist, I still would be a little bit reticent about going that far. But I think certainly having a political opinion and voicing that opinion is really important, and it's part of the polis, it's part of that wider democratic discourse. And a bit like, you know, there was that quote that Barbara Lee mentioned following September the 11th, which was from the congregation afterwards, from the church afterwards, where the priest says, you know, let us not as we act become the evil that we deplore. And it's this idea of not being magnanimous and considering the kind of future you want to build. And I think certainly that's something which you can consider on the page, but obviously it's such a huge topic, and it's so egotistical to think, oh right, great, yeah, I'm just going to sit down and write this beautiful poem that's going to solve world peace. You know, it's not really like that. But you can certainly encourage people to discuss issues with each other, I think.
Of course, that discussion can go on, and I was going through your poems, and I noticed that you directly you directly address the nature or the objects. For example, in one of the poems you write, "Hi Earth." So I would like to ask you, how much of communication do you receive from them, because you're communicating with them?
Yeah, that's so nice. Thank you so much. I think sort of I think there's sort of a very big tradition of pathetic fallacy, you know, this idea that as you stride along the heath, you know, in Victorian novels, the rain comes crashing down and your life is miserable, and the rain is there representing it, you know, it's just everything's kind of folded together and this is just awful, you know. But it's also a view that in the constructions in English, we often say, objectify nature and consider it as something there which is there for our pleasure, for our enjoyment, placed there presumably by divine providence. But in fact, sort of how you therefore find a way in to addressing nature is sort of from within the inside or as an equal. So to address Earth, High Earth is looking at trying to find new voices, new ways, a new register for talking about nature, and one as well that's sort of relatable, you know, that's accessible.
So
I think if
does
you think
the Earth say to you, "Hi, Harry," the way you are to the Earth?
yeah, I mean, in that poem, the whole thing is a huge Facebook timeline of the history of the Earth. So, but yeah, it seems more casual that way and more approachable rather than something that's divinely created that we can't touch. Yeah.
Quite right. Thank you so much for your beautiful answer, Harry. And as we approach toward the end of the session, thank you so much for joining us, Nicola, Elisa, George, and of course, Harry. And thank you, Sonnet, Mandal, and Tushar Dhaval Singh for organizing this beautiful session. And thank you, Chair Poetry Evenings. Let more poetry flow. Let more voices be heard. Thank you so much to all our viewers who had logged in and who have been listening to this beautiful rendition of these four lovely poets, brilliant poets. Thank you so much. Good evening.